He came for a quiet dinner at his own luxury restaurant, just another guest. Unnoticed, observing, but when he heard his manager threaten a young waiter, he put down his fork. What happened next would change everything. The glow of chandeliers bathed the dining hall in golden light, casting long shadows over the perfectly arranged tables. La Lumière, a name synonymous with luxury and exclusivity, was alive with murmured conversations and the clinking of fine crystal. Waiters in crisp black uniforms glided between tables, their every movement rehearsed to perfection. David stood near the bar, his hands gripping the edges of his serving tray a little too tightly. He had been working at La Lumière for only a few months, but every night felt like walking a tightrope. The clientele expected flawless service, anything less could mean humiliation. Or worse, dismissal. At the far end of the dining room, Richard, the restaurant's manager, held court like a king surveying his domain. Immaculately dressed, with an ever-present sneer, he moved with the confidence of someone who knew his power was absolute. His rules were simple. The wealthy were to be catered to without question, and the staff existed solely to serve. Anyone who fell short was disposable. David swallowed hard as he approached a particularly demanding table. 3 men in tailored suits lounged in leather chairs, speaking in low, authoritative voices. Their presence commanded attention, and their table, near the fireplace, was one of the most coveted spots in the restaurant. The eldest among them, a man in his 60s with silver hair slicked back, glanced at David with mild disinterest before returning to his conversation. At a table near the window, a man dined alone. Unlike the other patrons, he did not demand attention. He sat quietly, his suit impeccable but understated. The dim lighting cast subtle shadows on his face, accentuating the sharp angles of his jawline. He observed the room with a keen gaze, taking in the nuances of every interaction. His name was Alexander Pierce, though no one in the restaurant that evening knew he was the owner of the entire chain. David exhaled slowly and adjusted the bottle of Chateau Margaux on his tray. The wine was valued at more than his monthly rent, and he knew the stakes. His footsteps were steady as he approached the VIP table. But as he reached forward to pour, his fingers trembled ever so slightly. The moment was brief, a flicker of hesitation, a shift in balance. Then, disaster. The glass tilted just enough for the deep red liquid to spill, blooming across the pristine white linen of the man's shirt. Silence. The conversation at the table halted. The silver-haired man looked down at his stained shirt, his expression unreadable. David's stomach dropped. Before he could speak, Richard materialized beside him, moving with the practiced efficiency of a predator sensing weakness. "You incompetent fool," Richard hissed, his voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" David opened his mouth, but no words came. The silver-haired man set down his glass with deliberate precision, then looked up at Richard with a raised brow. "I assume this level of service is not what La Lumière is known for." Richard paled slightly, then turned to David with a cold glare. "You're done. Get out of my sight before you humiliate us further." The other waitstaff froze. No one moved to defend David. From his table near the window, Alexander took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving the scene unfolding before him. Richard straightened his jacket, clearly pleased with how swiftly he had handled the situation. He signaled to a nearby waiter to escort David away, his lips already forming an apology for the VIP guest. But as Richard turned, his eyes briefly met Alexander's. There was something unsettling in the way Alexander studied him, calm, assessing, as if peeling back layers to see what lay beneath. Richard hesitated. The moment was fleeting, but a chill ran down his spine before he could shake it off. Alexander didn't say a word. He simply swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching, waiting. David stood in the dimly lit staff corridor, his hands clenched at his sides. The sting of humiliation still burned hot on his face. The moment Richard had dismissed him, a waiter had swiftly placed a fresh glass of wine in front of the VIP guest, followed by an apology and a complimentary bottle of something even pricier. A show of good faith, Richard had called it, but there was no such courtesy for David. Instead, he had been ordered to the back, reprimanded in front of the kitchen staff, and assigned to cleaning duty for the rest of the evening. The message was clear. Mistakes were unforgivable. Unless, of course, you were the kind of customer who left a generous tip. As he scrubbed down the marble counter near the service station, a voice murmured beside him. "You're not the first, you know." David turned. Emma, one of the senior waitresses, stood next to him, placing a fresh tray of desserts onto the counter. She kept her eyes on her work, speaking just loud enough for him to hear over the hum of the kitchen. "Richard does this all the time," she continued, smoothing out a napkin. "If a guest spends enough, they can do whatever they want. Spill wine on themselves? Blame the waiter? Yell at staff? Management will look the other way. And if you cross Richard, well, you can guess how that ends." David swallowed the lump forming in his throat. He had suspected favoritism, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach churn. Out in the dining area, Alexander remained at his table, watching. His drink sat untouched, his mind elsewhere. He had seen enough to recognize a pattern: Richard's quickness to appease wealth, his utter disregard for the dignity of his employees. It wasn't just about the spilled wine. It was about a culture of power and manipulation, one that had been allowed to fester unchecked. He raised a hand slightly, signaling for a waiter. When the server approached, Alexander gestured toward his empty glass. "Another pour, please, and have your manager bring the bottle himself." The waiter hesitated, but a glance at Alexander's composed expression made him nod. "Right away, sir." A few moments later, Richard arrived at the table, bottle in hand, his usual air of authority firmly in place. "Mr. Pierce," he greeted smoothly, pouring the whiskey with a practiced hand. "I hope everything has been to your satisfaction this evening." Alexander studied him, searching for any flicker of awareness. Richard didn't recognize him, not yet. The thought was almost amusing. "The service has been revealing," Alexander replied, taking the glass. He swirled the liquid, watching the amber hues catch the light. "I couldn't help but notice the way you handled that incident earlier." Richard's smile barely wavered. An unfortunate situation, but you'll find that we hold our staff to the highest standards here. A mistake like that is unacceptable." Alexander nodded slowly. "And yet, I noticed another guest causing a disturbance not long after. Loud, disruptive, but there wasn't quite the same response." Richard stiffened ever so slightly. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Alexander caught it. "We prioritize our most valued patrons," Richard said carefully. "Some guests are, well, a bit more temperamental than others." Alexander murmured. "Selective enforcement of the rules. An interesting approach." Richard chuckled, though there was a hint of unease behind his carefully composed expression. "I assure you, sir, our priority is always to maintain an elegant and exclusive dining experience." Alexander took a sip of his whiskey, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make Richard uncomfortable. "Of course," he finally said, "thank you for your time." Richard hesitated, as if considering saying more, but ultimately gave a polite nod before excusing himself. As the manager retreated across the dining hall, Alexander pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the company's internal review system. A quick search of complaints related to Richard's management style revealed multiple reports, spanning months: allegations of favoritism, intimidation, even questionable financial transactions related to customer billing. It wasn't conclusive, but it was a start. As Alexander slipped his phone back into his pocket, a figure moved past his table. A folded slip of paper landed lightly beside his plate, so subtle it could have been mistaken for a napkin adjustment. He glanced up, catching a glimpse of a man in a server's uniform disappearing toward the kitchen. Alexander unfolded the note. The handwriting was hurried, but the message was clear. "If you really want the truth, look into Richard." A slow smile crossed Alexander's face. The real work was about to begin. Alexander sat in his study, the dim glow of a desk lamp casting elongated shadows against the walls. The slip of paper rested on the polished wood, its message simple yet powerful. "Look into Richard." His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of his chair. A gut feeling told him this wasn't just about one power-hungry manager. Corruption, especially in an industry like this, rarely existed in isolation. If Richard had been operating like this for years, it meant someone else had been allowing it, or benefiting from it. He picked up his phone and dialed. Within seconds, a familiar voice answered. Lucas, I need you to dig into something for me. Lucas, his trusted assistant, was efficient and meticulous. If there was something worth finding, Lucas would uncover it. Alexander relayed what he had witnessed at La Lumiere, emphasizing Richard's blatant favoritism, the fear among employees, and the note he had received. I want a full financial audit of that location. Look for discrepancies, anything that stands out. There was a brief pause. I'll start with the payroll and expense reports, Lucas said. See if there are any patterns. If Richard's dirty, the numbers will show it. A few hours later, Lucas called back. His voice carried the weight of something significant. You were right, he said. Something is off. Alexander leaned forward. Go on. There's a trend of employees quitting in waves, especially lower-level staff. Their departure records list vague reasons, personal matters, relocating, burnout, but the timeline is suspicious. Every few months, a group of them leaves at once. Coerced resignations? Possibly. And that's not the only thing. The restaurant's VIP expenses have nearly doubled over the past year. Expensive wine, specialty dishes, comped meals that don't match the number of high-profile guests actually dining there. Alexander exhaled slowly. Meaning money is moving somewhere it shouldn't be. He hung up and stared at the city lights beyond his window. Richard wasn't just running a restaurant. He was running a game. And Alexander intended to figure out exactly who was playing along. The next evening, he returned to La Lumiere. This time, he wasn't just a customer. He was a man looking for answers. David spotted him first. The young waiter hesitated before approaching, his posture uncertain. Good evening, sir. Welcome back. Alexander nodded. Busy night? David's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Same as always. Something about his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Alexander decided to push. How are things for you here? David glanced around before responding, careful to keep his voice low. It depends on who's asking. I'm asking. A flicker of hesitation. Then, a quiet sigh. It's not just me. A lot of us, people who aren't in Richard's good graces, get treated like we don't matter. Hours get cut. Shifts get changed at the last minute. If a customer complains about us, no one even asks for our side of the story. We're just replaced. Alexander's jaw tightened. And the ones who leave? David hesitated. Some quit because they have no choice. Some get pushed out. Before Alexander could ask more, another voice interrupted. Can I help you gentlemen with something? Emma had appeared beside them, a cautious expression on her face. She was older than David, her presence steady, though her sharp eyes carried years of quiet observation. Alexander recognized her as someone who had been working at La Lumiere for a long time. If anyone knew the truth, it was her. She placed a glass down on a nearby tray and folded her arms. You're asking a lot of questions, she said. Just curious. Alexander replied evenly. But if I'm right about Richard, maybe I should be concerned. Emma studied him for a long moment before speaking. Look, you seem like someone who actually cares. But you don't understand how things work here. She glanced toward the back of the restaurant, where Richard was speaking with a group of guests. He's got power, and when people cross him, they don't last long. Alexander held her gaze. Then why are you still here? She let out a short breath, as if debating how much to say. Somebody's got to keep an eye on things. Then tell me what you see. Emma hesitated, then lowered her voice. Richard lets certain guests get away with things. If someone wealthy makes a scene, nothing happens. Some of them, she looked away briefly, as if disgusted by the thought, have even harassed the staff. You think Richard cares? As long as they spend money. He looks the other way. Alexander's grip on his glass tightened. And no one's ever done anything? Emma laughed under her breath, though there was no humor in it. Who would? If we complain, we lose our jobs. And Richard. She glanced around again before leaning in slightly. He's not just a bad manager. He's connected. You think firing him would solve anything? He's got people behind him. Something in the way she said it sent a chill down Alexander's spine. As Emma straightened and returned to work, Alexander sat back in his chair. He had come here thinking Richard was the problem. But now, a much bigger question loomed. Who was protecting him? The report landed on Alexander's desk with a soft thud. Lucas had done his job well. The file was thick, packed with records, employee complaints, and financial inconsistencies. As Alexander flipped through the pages, a clear pattern emerged. Richard had never stayed in one place for too long. He had managed several high-end restaurants within the company, each time leaving under questionable circumstances. The details were vague: staff resigning abruptly, financial records showing unexplained losses, management shifting blame to operational inefficiencies. But one thing stood out: each time Richard was reassigned, it followed an incident that had quietly been swept under the rug. At the center of it all was a name Alexander recognized immediately: Arthur Grant. Alexander leaned back in his chair, pressing his fingers together. Arthur wasn't just another wealthy investor. He was one of the company's major backers, a man with influence beyond the restaurant business. If Richard was answering to him, that meant the corruption didn't stop at La Lumiere. It stretched into the higher levels of the company itself. Lucas's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's more," he said. "I ran a deep dive into La Lumiere's financials. A lot of the high-ticket items, wines, imported ingredients, VIP services, don't match up with actual sales." Alexander frowned. Meaning? Meaning, someone is covering the difference, Lucas said, and based on these numbers, it's not just about keeping the VIPs happy. These transactions look like classic money laundering. Someone's funneling cash through the restaurant under the guise of high-end purchases. Alexander exhaled slowly. "And you think Richard is the one handling it?" Lucas hesitated. "I think he's involved, but I don't think he's the one pulling the strings." That was what Alexander had feared. He closed the file and reached for his jacket. It was time to pay Emma another visit. David had told him she was one of the few employees who had been around long enough to see everything. If there was more to be uncovered, she would know where to start. He found her in the back of the restaurant, taking a short break near the supply room. She looked up as he approached, setting her coffee down. "I had a feeling you'd be back," she said. Alexander didn't waste time. "I need to know about the complaints against Richard." Emma's expression darkened. She crossed her arms, eyes scanning the empty hallway before speaking. "It's not just about him playing favorites," she said. "There have been incidents worse than what you saw the other night." Alexander nodded for her to continue. "There was a girl," she said after a pause. "Young, new. One of the VIPs liked her a little too much. He cornered her after hours. She went to Richard, hoping he'd do something." Alexander already knew where this was going. Emma shook her head. "He told her to drop it. Said the guest was important. Offered her money to stay quiet. She quit the next day." His jaw tightened. "And no one reported it?" Emma gave a dry laugh. "To who? Richard has the district manager in his pocket. Anyone who causes trouble either gets reassigned or fired." Alexander felt the anger simmer beneath his calm exterior. "There was another case," Emma continued. "A chef, one of the best we had. He got into an argument with Richard after refusing to cater to some guests' ridiculous demands. A week later, he was gone, no warning, just packed up and left." Alexander studied her. "Did he leave, or was he forced out?" Emma sighed. "I don't know. But I know he was scared." That was enough for Alexander. He had heard enough to confirm what he already suspected: Richard wasn't just an incompetent manager. He was part of something larger. Something that required silence and compliance from those around him. But to take him down, Alexander needed proof. That night, Lucas sent him another update. "I found something," he said. "There's a secondary ledger hidden in the restaurant's financial records. It's disguised as special hospitality expenses, but the numbers don't match the main books." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What's it covering?" Lucas hesitated. "I think Richard is using company funds to cover personal favors for VIPs. Expensive wines, last-minute gifts, even private reservations that don't appear in the official schedule." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "He's paying out of the restaurant's own pocket to keep certain people happy." Exactly. It was the break he had been waiting for. But now, he needed a witness. Someone willing to step forward and confirm what was happening behind closed doors. He glanced at his phone. Considering his options, David had too much to lose. Emma knew too much but had been careful for a reason. Alexander needed someone on the inside who was willing to risk everything. And if such a person didn't exist, He would have to make Richard expose himself. Alexander knew that brute force wouldn't take Richard down. He needed strategy. Richard had built his authority on a foundation of arrogance and impunity. Believing himself untouchable, the best way to expose him was to let that arrogance do the work. He sat across from David and Emma in a quiet corner of a small cafe. Far from La Lumiere, the lights were dim, the air thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans. David fidgeted with his cup, his nerves evident. Emma, on the other hand, leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, listening intently. "I need proof," Alexander said, his voice measured. "Something solid. Witness statements are good, but I need evidence that can't be dismissed." David hesitated before speaking. "How do we do that without getting caught? Richard already watches everything we do." Alexander nodded. "We make him slip up in a way he can't explain." He placed a folder on the table. Inside was a guest list for an upcoming private event at La Lumiere, a lavish dinner for VIP clientele. The kind of crowd Richard bent over backward to please. Alexander had quietly arranged for the most influential figures in the restaurant industry to be present: investors, journalists, senior board members, people who, if given the right push, could put Richard in a position where he had no way out. During this dinner, Alexander continued, "Richard is going to do exactly what he always does: favor the wealthy, humiliate those beneath him, and this time, we'll be ready." Emma glanced at the papers. "How do you know he'll take the bait?" "Because he doesn't think he has anything to hide," Alexander said simply. "To him, this is business as usual." David looked uneasy. "And what do you want us to do?" "Observe," Alexander said, "and when the moment comes, make sure it's caught on record." While plans for the dinner were being finalized, Lucas was working another angle. He had tracked down a former employee, a chef named Mark who had left La Lumiere under circumstances no one had questioned at the time. Mark had agreed to meet, but he was wary. When Lucas found him, he was sitting at the far end of a nearly empty bar, a drink in hand, his expression guarded. "I don't know what you expect me to say," Mark muttered as Lucas sat beside him. "Just the truth," Lucas said. Mark let out a hollow laugh. "The truth doesn't get you very far when you're up against people like Richard." Lucas ordered a drink but didn't touch it. "You left suddenly," he said. "No warning, no reason given. That's not normal for someone in your position." Mark exhaled through his nose, staring at his glass. "I didn't leave," he admitted. "I was forced out." Lucas remained silent, letting the words come on their own. Richard had been skimming from the restaurant's revenue. Mark continued, "Not just a little, a lot. We all knew something was off. But no one said anything, until I did." Lucas leaned forward. "And?" Mark shook his head. "I was told to keep my mouth shut. Then suddenly, I started getting written up for things that never happened. Orders going missing. Complaints that were never made. It was all an excuse to push me out without raising suspicion." Lucas pulled out his phone. "If I asked you to testify against him, would you?" Mark gave him a long look. Then, he laughed again. "But there was no amusement in it. Not unless you plan on taking down the guy protecting him, too." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "Arthur Grant?" Mark nodded. "Richard's just a pawn. Arthur's the real player. You want to take Richard down? You better be ready to deal with Arthur." The night of the VIP dinner arrived, and La Lumiere was a stage set for a performance Richard didn't know he was starring in. The restaurant buzzed with energy, guests filtering in, their conversations laced with expectation. The dining hall gleamed under warm lighting, tables adorned with the finest arrangements. At the center of it all was Richard, moving from guest to guest with effortless charm. He was in his element, completely unaware that every move he made was being watched. Alexander sat at a table near the back, blending into the background. He wasn't here to enjoy the food. He was here to watch Richard dig his own grave. It didn't take long. A high-profile guest, a man Richard clearly deemed important, made an offhand complaint about a server. Within moments, Richard was berating the employee, his voice low but sharp, his displeasure visible even from a distance. The staff member, caught off guard, stammered an apology. Richard didn't accept it. He turned to the guest and, with a laugh, assured him that he'd take care of it. And then, just as expected, he made a show of dismissing the server, right in front of the entire room. There was a shift in the atmosphere. Some guests chuckled uncomfortably, others glanced around, unsure of what to make of the public humiliation. But Richard, so caught up in playing the role of an accommodating host, didn't notice. What he also didn't notice was the small, carefully placed camera discreetly capturing every second of it. The dinner continued, but the damage had been done. Richard had revealed himself exactly as planned. As the evening wound down, Alexander rose from his seat and made his way toward Richard, who was still basking in the glow of another successful evening. He stopped just within arm's reach. Richard turned, clearly about to deliver another rehearsed pleasantry, until he recognized Alexander. His expression flickered for the briefest moment. Alexander smiled. "Good evening, Richard." Richard straightened. "I hope you're enjoying your meal, sir." "Oh, I'm enjoying quite a bit," Alexander replied. He let the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle Richard. Then, in a voice low enough for only him to hear, he added, "It's fascinating watching how you run things." There it was, the flicker of unease. Richard recovered quickly, offering a tight-lipped smile. "We do our best to meet the highest standards." Alexander held his gaze. "We'll see," he said. Then he turned and walked away. Behind him, Richard remained still, watching. He didn't know it yet, but the walls around him had already started to close in. Alexander sat at the head of the long, polished conference table, his expression unreadable. The walls of the boardroom were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Yet no one in the room was paying attention to the view. All eyes were on Richard, who sat stiffly in one of the leather chairs, hands clasped together on the table. The meeting had been called without warning. Richard had arrived expecting routine business but had found himself in the middle of an interrogation. Lucas stood beside a large screen, flipping through a series of documents and financial statements. His voice was steady, professional, but the weight of his words left no room for doubt. "There are significant discrepancies in La Lumiere's financial records," Lucas said, "particularly regarding VIP expenses and unaccounted for transactions. These expenses don't align with actual guest numbers, and multiple payments have been redirected to private accounts." Richard shifted in his seat. "This is nonsense," he said. "Every VIP establishment has discretionary expenses. We cater to high-end clients. These costs are standard." Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he clicked on the next slide. The screen now displayed a still image from the hidden camera footage taken at the VIP dinner. It was a perfect shot of Richard berating an employee while laughing alongside a privileged guest. The tension in the room thickened. Emma, sitting across the table, let out a quiet breath. Beside her, Mark, the former chef who had been forced out, watched Richard with cold eyes. Neither of them spoke, but their presence alone spoke volumes. Richard's posture straightened, his jaw tightening. "Where did you get that?" Alexander finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured. "Does it matter?" Richard forced a smirk. "You think one video of me handling a staff issue is going to bring me down?" He leaned back slightly. "You and I both know that's not enough." Alexander tilted his head. "Then let's move on." He gave Lucas a small nod. The next slide came up. This time, it was a breakdown of transactions, payments made to unknown accounts, marked under special hospitality expenses. The amounts were staggering. Lucas turned to the room. These funds weren't used for operational costs. They were diverted. He let the words settle before adding, "And some of them ended up in offshore accounts linked to private shell companies." Richard scoffed. "You think I moved company money into offshore accounts? That's a serious accusation." Alexander met his gaze. "It is, but I'm not accusing you, yet. I'd rather hear your explanation first." The door to the boardroom suddenly opened. Arthur Grant stepped inside. He moved with the confidence of a man who never questioned his own authority. Taking a seat without waiting for an invitation, he adjusted his cufflinks before speaking. "I apologize for being late," Arthur said smoothly. "I heard this meeting involved certain misunderstandings regarding company policy." He glanced at Richard before turning his attention to Alexander. "I trust we can clear those up quickly." Alexander didn't flinch. "That depends on how you define misunderstandings." Arthur's smile didn't reach his eyes. Richard was following procedures that have been in place for years. Our VIP program has always required a certain level of discretion. He gestured toward the documents on the screen. These expenses? They're a necessary part of maintaining client relationships. If we start questioning every transaction that doesn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet, we risk damaging those relationships. Alexander leaned forward slightly. So you're saying Richard's actions were sanctioned from above? Arthur exhaled as if dealing with an inconvenience. I'm saying Richard operates under the same directives as every other manager. If he made a mistake in handling a particular situation, that's a performance issue, not a financial scandal. Richard said nothing. His earlier arrogance had faded, replaced by a wariness Alexander hadn't seen before. He was waiting, assessing. Alexander pressed forward. And the offshore accounts? Arthur's expression remained neutral. If you're implying criminal activity, I suggest you be careful with your words. Lucas, unfazed, clicked to the next document. There's something else, he said. A new page appeared on the screen. A financial trail leading directly from one of Le Lumiere's accounts to a private fund controlled by Arthur Grant. The amount was large, far beyond what could be dismissed as simple discretionary spending. Silence filled the room. For the first time, Arthur's composure faltered. His eyes flickered toward Richard, and in that moment, Alexander saw the shift, the unraveling of their dynamic. Richard saw it too. And then, the unexpected happened. Richard turned toward Arthur, his voice laced with barely restrained bitterness. I followed your orders, he said. Every damn thing I did because you made it clear that's how this business runs. Arthur's gaze darkened. Careful, Richard. But Richard wasn't careful. You think I was the only one? Richard said, his voice rising slightly. How many other managers have been given the same playbook? You're the one who benefits from all this. Not me. Alexander watched the power dynamic shift. Richard was scrambling to save himself. If that meant throwing Arthur under the bus, so be it. Arthur remained calm, but the tension in his jaw was evident. You're making a mistake. Richard let out a hollow laugh. No, Arthur, I made a mistake trusting you. Alexander tapped a finger against the table. So just to be clear, he said, you're saying that the orders didn't come from you, Richard, but from Arthur? Richard hesitated, and that was all Alexander needed. The investigation had just expanded beyond one corrupt manager. It had just reached the top. The boardroom had emptied, but the weight of the confrontation still lingered in the air. Alexander remained seated, his fingers pressed together in thought. The pieces had fallen into place, and the picture they revealed was far worse than he had anticipated. Arthur Grant wasn't just complicit, he was the architect. Across the table, Richard sat hunched forward, rubbing his temples. His earlier defiance had faded, replaced by something more primal. Survival. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was bargaining. You want to know how deep this goes? Richard muttered, voice tight. Fine, I'll tell you. Alexander didn't respond. He simply waited. Richard exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. Arthur used the VIP program as a front. On the surface, it looks like we're just catering to high-end clients, free meals, luxury perks, the best service money can buy. But the truth? Some of those transactions were never real. They were covers for something else. Alexander's eyes darkened. Money laundering. Richard gave a bitter laugh. That's the polite way of putting it. He leaned back, shaking his head. Arthur's been using the restaurant chain to move cash for a group of investors, people with deep pockets and no interest in being traced. They funnel money in through fake reservations, overpriced wine orders, and fabricated, exclusive events. It's all washed clean by the time it leaves the books. Alexander absorbed the information, his mind already running calculations. And the favoritism? Richard's smirk was humorless. A necessary part of the game. Those VIPs? Half of them don't even pay for their meals. They're just faces. People used to justify the absurd numbers on the ledger. Meanwhile, anyone who actually spends money gets squeezed for every dollar. Alexander's jaw tightened. And the offshore accounts? Richard hesitated, but when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. Some of the money never makes it back. It disappears. Arthur handles that part himself. Silence settled between them. Alexander studied Richard, measuring the desperation in his expression. Why tell me this now? Richard scoffed. Because I'm not an idiot. You think Arthur's going to protect me now that you've blown this open? No. He's already looking for a way to pin this all on me. If I don't get ahead of it, I go down alone. Alexander nodded slowly. Then prove it. Richard's lips pressed together. After a moment, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and slid it across the table. That's access to my company email. You'll find plenty there: correspondence, financial reports, directives from Arthur himself. Alexander picked up the phone, glancing at the screen before pocketing it. This better be worth it. Richard leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. Oh, it is. Later that evening, Alexander met with Lucas in his office. The city glowed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, headlights streaking through the dark streets below. Lucas had spent hours sifting through Richard's emails, cross-referencing them with the financial data they had already collected. It's worse than we thought, Lucas said, setting his laptop on the desk. Arthur's got multiple shell companies, all tied to fake transactions routed through La Lumiere and other restaurants in the chain. Alexander studied the documents. Who else is involved? Lucas scrolled through the records. Some high-profile names, a few politicians, several corporate investors. And get this, one of the companies linked to Arthur's offshore accounts is a consulting firm that just received a multi-million-dollar government contract. Alexander exhaled sharply. So this isn't just corporate corruption. This is political. Lucas nodded grimly. If we go after Arthur, we're not just taking down a businessman. We're hitting an entire network of people who've built their fortunes on dirty money. Alexander leaned back, fingers tapping against the desk. He had known Arthur was powerful, but this changed everything. The stakes were higher, and the risks far greater. Still, there was no turning back now. Arthur must have sensed the shift in the air because by morning, the counterattack had already begun. A memo was sent out to the board, calling for an emergency meeting. The message was clear. Arthur intended to take control of the situation before Alexander could. By the time Alexander arrived at the conference room, the room was already filled. Board members sat in tense silence, their gazes darting between him and Arthur, who stood at the far end of the table, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease. I'll get straight to the point, Arthur began, his voice smooth. It's come to my attention that certain individuals within this company are acting recklessly, digging into matters they don't fully understand, jeopardizing our stability. Alexander folded his arms. And by individuals, you mean me? Arthur smiled, though his eyes remained cold. If the shoe fits. Alexander remained silent, letting him continue. There have been rumors, Arthur went on, turning to the board members. Allegations thrown around without evidence. And now, the man who is supposed to be leading this company is instead choosing to undermine it. He gestured toward Alexander. I won't allow that. One of the board members hesitated. Arthur, what exactly are you suggesting? Arthur placed his hands on the table. That Alexander is creating unnecessary chaos. That his actions are making investors nervous. And that, for the good of this company, we need to reconsider whether he is still fit to lead. A murmur rippled through the room. Alexander remained calm, but inside, he felt the noose tightening. Arthur was trying to turn the board against him. It was a bold move, one that could work if enough people doubted Alexander's leadership. But Arthur had underestimated him. Alexander reached into his pocket, pulling out a small USB drive. He placed it on the table, then leaned forward, his gaze locked on Arthur's. Since you're so concerned about evidence, he said, voice steady, let's take a look. Lucas, seated at the far end, plugged the drive into the conference room's display system. Within moments, a series of financial records appeared on the screen, transactions linking Arthur directly to the offshore accounts. Emails instructing Richard on how to manipulate the books. Messages referencing the network of investors involved. The room fell into stunned silence. Arthur's face didn't change, but Alexander saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition. He had lost control of the narrative. Alexander sat back. If anyone should be worried about their position here, Arthur, it's you. The balance of power had just shifted. Arthur Grant didn't waste time striking back. By the morning after the boardroom confrontation, Alexander knew the counterattack had begun. The first sign came in the form of whispers among the board members. A few of them, men who had nodded in agreement the night before, now avoided his gaze. Their hesitation wasn't surprising. Arthur had deep connections, and not everyone had the stomach for a fight that could cost them money, influence, or worse, their reputations. By noon, Alexander received a call from Lucas. "We have a problem," Lucas said. "David's been suspended." Alexander's grip on the phone tightened. For what? No explanation. Just told to pack up and leave for an indefinite period. Lucas's voice carried an edge. "Arthur's making his move. He's sending a message." Alexander exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temple. Arthur was warning him, walk away, or more people would get hurt. That evening, an unmarked envelope arrived at Alexander's office. No return address. The paper inside was crisp, folded neatly. The message was brief, typed in plain black ink. "Stop now. Walk away." Alexander stared at the words, his pulse steady. Threats like this weren't new to him, but that didn't make them any less dangerous. If Arthur was resorting to intimidation, it meant he was feeling pressure. That, at least, was a small victory. An hour later, Lucas burst through the door, a tablet in hand. His expression was tight with urgency. "They're attacking you publicly now." He placed the tablet on the desk. The screen displayed a newly published article. The headline was vague but insidious. "Instability at the top. Growing internal conflicts in La Lumiere's leadership." The article didn't mention Alexander by name, but it didn't have to. The language was careful, crafted to imply that the company was in turmoil, that the leadership was fracturing. It was the kind of piece that planted doubt, setting the stage for investors to start asking uncomfortable questions. Alexander read through it once, then again. He had expected Arthur to push back, but this was a calculated move. No outright accusations, just enough smoke to make people suspect there was a fire. Lucas watched him. "What do we do?" Alexander tapped his fingers against the desk. "We keep going." The next night, Lucas made a breakthrough. "I found it," he said, standing in the doorway of Alexander's study. His laptop was open, the glow from the screen casting sharp shadows across his face. Alexander looked up. "Found what?" "The missing link." Lucas walked forward, setting the laptop down in front of him. "Arthur's been funneling money through a secondary account. From there, it's been transferred to a financial firm, a shell company. Probably. But here's the part that matters." He clicked a few keys. That firm just moved a significant amount to a known laundering operation overseas. Alexander leaned in, reading the transaction records. "That's it," he murmured. "That's the trail that gets him prosecuted." Lucas nodded. "If we go public with this, Arthur won't just lose his position. He'll be facing federal charges." Alexander exhaled, sitting back. He had wanted to dismantle Arthur's influence. But this was bigger. This was enough to end him entirely. The next morning, Richard vanished. Alexander arrived at the office to find Lucas already waiting. "He's gone," Lucas said before Alexander could speak. "No sign of him since last night. No calls. No emails. His apartment is empty. Arthur got to him." Alexander muttered. Lucas's expression was grim. Richard ran before things got worse. Neither option was good. If Arthur had silenced Richard, it meant he was closing ranks. If Richard had run, it meant he knew something even worse was coming. An hour later, Emma walked into Alexander's office, her face pale. She placed a large envelope on the desk. "This was in my locker this morning." Alexander opened it. Inside was a stack of documents, contracts, financial statements. The first page alone made his stomach tighten. "These are forged," he said, flipping through them. "They're making it look like someone else authorized the transactions." Emma nodded. "And if I had to guess, they'll use them to shift the blame away from Arthur." Arthur was preparing an escape route. If the documents were released, someone else, perhaps even Richard, would take the fall, leaving Arthur with plausible deniability. Alexander set the papers down. "We're out of time." Lucas straightened. "What's the plan?" Alexander's gaze darkened. "We hit first." Arthur thought he was untouchable. He thought he controlled the narrative. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated Alexander Pierce. The plan had to be flawless. There would be no second chances. Alexander sat in his office, the city glowing behind him, the weight of the coming hours pressing down on his shoulders. Across from him, Lucas adjusted his laptop, running through the final details. The shareholders' conference starts at noon. Lucas said, "We have confirmation that Arthur will be giving a speech. He's using it to reassure investors after all the rumors." Alexander nodded. "That's exactly what we need. He'll try to downplay everything. Make it seem like business as usual." Lucas tapped the screen. "And this is where we hit him. The moment he denies any wrongdoing, we drop the evidence." Alexander studied the files Lucas had compiled. Financial statements, offshore accounts, hidden recordings. Each piece carefully placed to create a trap that Arthur couldn't escape. But then came the complication. Richard was back. He had been gone for days. And when he finally reappeared, it wasn't with threats or arrogance. It was with an offer. He sat across from Alexander, looking thinner, more restless. The usual smugness was gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. "I have proof," Richard said. "Emails, internal memos, transactions that show Arthur authorized everything." Alexander leaned back. "And what do you want in return?" Richard licked his lips. "I walk away. No charges. No media circus. You let me disappear, and you get everything you need to bury him." Lucas, standing at the doorway, scoffed. "You think you deserve a deal?" Richard shot him a glare but didn't argue. He knew he had no bargaining power beyond what he was offering. Alexander remained silent, weighing the decision. Richard was scum, but he was also a key to bringing Arthur down. If they accepted the deal, they'd get undeniable proof, but they'd also let a man who had enabled years of corruption go free. "I need to think," Alexander said. Richard frowned. "You don't have time to think." "I'm making time," Alexander replied, voice cold. "You'll have my answer soon." Emma had spent the past few days working on another angle. She had reached out to a board member who wasn't fully in Arthur's pocket, someone with influence but no direct ties to the corruption. That night, she met with them at a private lounge, choosing a location far from the corporate offices. The board member, an older woman named Evelyn Carter, listened carefully as Emma laid out what she knew. "I don't like Arthur," Evelyn admitted, "but going against him isn't easy. He's built relationships that protect him." Emma leaned forward. "Those relationships won't matter when the truth comes out. We have proof. We just need people willing to stand up when the moment comes." Evelyn exhaled slowly, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "And you're sure Alexander won't back down?" Emma nodded. "He's already in too deep. There's no walking away now." Evelyn studied her for a moment, then gave a small smile. "Then you have my support." Meanwhile, David had been working from the shadows. Despite his suspension, he still had access to certain parts of the restaurant, places where people spoke freely, believing they were safe. That was how he caught Arthur in a moment of weakness. The recording wasn't long, but it was enough. Arthur, speaking with a longtime investor, his voice calm, confident. "We handle things discreetly. The money moves through the restaurant. The books stay clean. As long as no one asks the wrong questions, everything works." David listened to the playback twice before sending the file to Lucas. With all the pieces in place, Alexander made his decision. Richard thought he was playing his last card, but Alexander saw a different opportunity. "We'll use him," he told Lucas. "Let him believe we're taking his deal, and then we'll turn him into the final piece of the trap." Lucas smirked. "How?" "By making him think he's still in control." The next morning, Alexander met with Richard again. This time, he accepted the offer, but with a condition. "You'll hand over everything," Alexander said, "and then, at the shareholders' conference, you'll confirm it yourself." Richard paled. "You want me to speak?" "I want you to tell them what you told me. Let Arthur watch as his own man testifies against him." Richard hesitated, but he was too far gone to argue. He had no allies left, no protection. He agreed. He had no idea that the moment he spoke, Alexander would reveal the additional evidence, making sure Richard couldn't slip away unscathed. By the time the conference ended, both Richard and Arthur would be finished. Alexander sat back, satisfied. The game was almost over. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Hotel shimmered under the glow of opulent chandeliers. Rows of neatly arranged chairs faced the stage, where the company's crest loomed on a massive screen. The annual shareholders' meeting was always a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated display of power and stability. Today, However, the air carried an undercurrent of unease, like a storm brewing just beyond the gilded walls. Arthur Grant arrived in his usual commanding fashion, his tailored suit immaculate, his stride confident. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting investors, shaking hands, projecting the image of a man in full control. He had spent the past week reinforcing his influence, assuring board members that any turmoil within the company was the result of overblown paranoia. He had no idea that the foundation beneath him was about to collapse. Alexander sat near the back, calm, unreadable. Next to him, Lucas discreetly checked his phone, ensuring that everything was in place. Emma was stationed near the control booth, watching the stage intently. David, though officially still suspended, had managed to slip into the hall unnoticed, waiting for his cue. The moment Richard stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Richard cleared his throat, gripping the podium. He had played his role well so far, timid, regretful, a man caught in the crossfire of bigger forces. Now came the moment of betrayal. I want to address the recent concerns surrounding our financial practices. Richard began, voice steady. Certain accusations have been made, and I want to be clear. I have always acted under the guidance of senior leadership. Specifically, under Arthur Grant. A murmur rippled through the room. Arthur, seated in the front row, stiffened. Richard pressed on. Any financial discrepancies, any irregularities, were directives handed down to me. I did what I was told. I trusted that these were strategic decisions for the company's benefit. He paused, then delivered the final blow. But if mistakes were made, they were not mine alone. Arthur Grant is the one who authorized these transactions. The silence was deafening. Arthur rose from his seat, his usual smooth demeanor cracking. That's a blatant lie, he snapped. I never authorized anything illegal. Richard turned to him, feigning confusion. But Arthur, we discussed this multiple times. The VIP transactions, the offshore funds, you assured me everything was taken care of. Arthur's jaw tightened. That's not what happened, and you know it. Then what did happen? Richard challenged. If you weren't involved, who approved these financial decisions? Arthur clenched his fists. He had spent years controlling every narrative, every conversation. Now, in front of dozens of shareholders, he was being forced to react. Behind the scenes, Lucas gave Emma a slight nod. She pressed a button on her tablet. A voice crackled over the speakers, Arthur's own voice. Gasps spread through the audience. Arthur's own words, undeniable and damning. A shareholder stood up. What the hell is this? Arthur? Arthur's expression darkened. This is a setup, he growled. That recording proves nothing. Conversations can be edited, manipulated. But the room had already begun to turn against him. He scanned the crowd, looking for allies, but saw only shifting gazes, hesitant expressions. He needed to take control before the situation spiraled further. You all need to understand something, Arthur said, forcing authority back into his voice. If I go down, I won't be the only one. Many of you have benefited from these deals. If you start picking this apart, you risk unraveling much more than you realize. Fear flickered in the eyes of a few board members. That was Arthur's last remaining weapon, mutual destruction. If he fell, he would drag others with him. Alexander stood up. His presence commanded instant attention. A system that depends on men like Arthur isn't a system worth protecting. He said, voice calm but firm. If we ignore this corruption, we invite worse. The only way forward is to cut out the rot, no matter how deep it runs. He turned to the screen behind the stage, where Lucas had prepared the final revelation. This is the evidence, Alexander continued, not just of mismanagement, but of deliberate fraud. Arthur Grant funneled millions into offshore accounts, using this company as a personal bank to shield himself from legal consequences. Numbers flashed on the screen, wire transfers, shell company registrations, tax evasion schemes, all traced back to Arthur. But the final strike came in the form of a video. It was a recorded interview, taken just days before. The image of a former employee appeared on the screen, their voice steady despite the weight of their words. I was instructed by Arthur Grant himself to sign off on fake invoices. The employee said, when I questioned it, I was threatened. I left because I knew if I stayed, I'd either be complicit or I'd end up like the others who spoke out. The silence in the room was absolute. Arthur had no comeback, no excuse. The moment stretched, unbearable, before a board member finally spoke. "We need a vote," they said, voice uncertain but firm. Now, Arthur looked around, realizing, too late, that there was no one left to protect him. His reign was over. Arthur Grant had spent years carefully constructing his empire, surrounding himself with allies, silencing dissenters, and making sure every decision served his interests. But in the end, it only took a few minutes for it all to start crumbling. The moment the evidence went public, the room had shifted. The gasps of disbelief, the hurried whispers between board members. Arthur had seen it happen before. Just never to himself. Now, standing in the center of the storm, he felt the weight of it pressing down on him. "This is a setup," Arthur said, his voice sharp but unsteady. "Fabricated evidence, taken out of context." "Enough," one of the senior board members interrupted. Arthur turned, recognizing the speaker, Evelyn Carter, the normally reserved but influential shareholder who had rarely spoken out before. But now, her tone was firm, unyielding. "The documents speak for themselves," she continued. "And the recording, Arthur. That was your voice. There's no way to spin this." Arthur opened his mouth to respond. But before he could, Richard, of all people, stood up. "Everything I did," Richard said, his voice carrying through the room, "I did under Arthur's orders." The betrayal was swift, calculated. Richard had been a man drowning, willing to cling to whatever lifeline he could find. And in this moment, the only way to save himself was to ensure Arthur took the fall alone. Arthur's expression twisted with fury. "You coward," he spat. "You think they'll protect you?" Richard shrugged, as if the outcome was already out of his hands. "I think they'll be too busy taking you down to worry about me." A vote was called immediately. The board members sat in tense silence as the motion to remove Arthur Grant from his position was formally introduced. Arthur didn't wait to hear the count. He had spent enough time in these rooms to know when the numbers weren't in his favor. Instead, as the ballots were cast, he pulled out his phone, stepping away from the table. Lucas, watching from across the room, nudged Alexander. "He's calling someone," he murmured, "probably looking for an escape route." Alexander didn't react, but he had expected this. Arthur still believed in the safety net he had built, the favors he had done for powerful people, the debts that had yet to be repaid. He assumed he could make one call and walk away untouched. But Alexander had moved first. While Arthur's fingers moved quickly over his phone screen, trying to reach a high-ranking government contact, Lucas had already sent out the final blow. A press release. Within moments, headlines began flashing across every major news outlet. Arthur Grant implicated in corporate fraud scandal. CEO faces investigation amidst money laundering allegations. Insider sources reveal years of financial manipulation. The media had been waiting for this. The second they got the files, the story spread like wildfire. Within minutes, Arthur's phone calls would go unanswered. No one would touch him now. Arthur froze as his screen lit up, not with an incoming call, but with news alerts. He looked up, his face going pale as he realized what had happened. Alexander finally spoke. "It's over, Arthur." Arthur's last play was desperation. "I've been running this company for years," he said, his voice lower, measured. "I built this. Without me, the entire operation will suffer." He turned to the board members. "You think removing me solves your problems? You'll lose investors. Stock prices will plummet. We'll be weaker, vulnerable." Another board member, a man who had once been one of Arthur's staunchest allies, shook his head. "We're already weak because of you," he said. "This company will survive, but you won't." Arthur's mask cracked. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. The final vote came in. The decision was unanimous. Arthur Grant was removed from his position, effective immediately. His assets within the company were frozen. A full-scale financial investigation would begin immediately. Arthur stood there for a long moment, his breathing steady but his fists clenched. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he moved toward Alexander, stopping just inches away. He leaned in slightly and whispered, "You won this round, but I'm not the only one in this game." Alexander didn't flinch. He met Arthur's gaze, unwavering. "I know," he replied, Arthur stepped back, straightened his suit, and walked out of the room. For the first time in years, he had no power, no control, and the game had only just begun. Arthur Grant was gone, his influence erased, his empire dismantled, but Alexander knew the battle wasn't just about removing a single man. Corruption didn't disappear overnight, it adapted, evolved, found new cracks to slip through. If the system itself didn't change, another Arthur would rise to take his place. The first step was making sure that didn't happen. Alexander stood at the head of a long conference table in the executive boardroom. Around him sat the senior management team, most of whom had been too afraid to speak against Arthur before. Now, their silence came from uncertainty, not fear. They didn't know what kind of leader Alexander would be. He clasped his hands together, letting the tension settle before speaking. This company has spent years catering to power instead of principles, he said. That ends today. He turned to a presentation screen, where Lucas had pulled up a list of new company-wide policies. First, Alexander continued, the VIP program is being restructured. No more under-the-table deals. No more unspoken rules that favor some and exploit others. Transparency is the new standard. A few nervous glances passed between the executives. Some of them had benefited from those very privileges. Second, Alexander went on, there will be a formal employee grievance process. Any worker who experiences mistreatment will have the ability to report it, without fear of retaliation. A murmur spread through the room. This was new territory. Under Arthur's rule, complaints had been ignored or buried. Lastly, Alexander said, his tone unwavering, we're establishing an independent oversight team. No more unchecked power. No more conflicts of interest. If we're going to earn back the trust of our employees and our customers, we need accountability at every level. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Evelyn Carter, the board member who had helped take Arthur down, gave a slow nod of approval. Others followed. The system was changing. Later that afternoon, Emma and David walked into La Lumiere for the first time since their suspensions. The atmosphere in the restaurant felt different, lighter, as if the weight of unspoken corruption had finally lifted. Emma glanced around, taking it all in. It actually feels like a place worth working at again, she murmured. David, still cautious, folded his arms. Feels like a calm before the storm, he muttered. Emma arched an eyebrow. You really think Arthur still has a way to come back from this? David shook his head. Not him, but people like him. In the following weeks, some high-profile customers who had once wielded their VIP status like a weapon began to quietly withdraw their business. A few sent thinly veiled complaints. But Alexander didn't care. The restaurant's reputation was already improving in a different way, one built on honesty rather than intimidation. Meanwhile, a hiring process was underway to replace Richard. This time, Alexander wasn't looking for someone who played politics. He wanted a leader, not another enforcer. When the final candidate was selected, he made the announcement personally. Standing before the assembled staff, Alexander spoke plainly. This restaurant is only as strong as the people who work in it. From now on, you won't answer to fear. You'll answer to integrity. But just when it seemed like the worst was behind them, Lucas walked into Alexander's office with a troubled expression. We still have a problem, he said, setting a folder on the desk. Alexander opened it, skimming the documents inside. Bank records, transaction trails, ones that hadn't been accounted for in the original investigation. These accounts, Lucas explained, they weren't controlled by Arthur. Or at least, not just him. Alexander's gaze sharpened. If Arthur wasn't the only one pulling the strings, he said, closing the folder, then we've been fighting the wrong final battle. He turned his chair toward the window, staring at the city skyline. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. Alexander had spent years navigating the complexities of corporate power, but nothing had prepared him for how quickly shadows could shift. He had dismantled Arthur Grant's empire, exposed corruption, and restored order to La Lumiere. He had assumed the war was over. But wars never ended that cleanly. Lucas stood across from him in his office, arms crossed, his laptop open on the desk. The screen displayed a series of financial records, transactions Alexander had never seen before. These accounts don't belong to Arthur, Lucas said. They were connected to him. Sure, but they were never under his name. Alexander leaned forward, scanning the details. The sums were staggering. Large-scale money movements, routed through shell companies, all tied to one unfamiliar name. Nathaniel Crawford. Alexander sat back. Who the hell is Nathaniel Crawford? Lucas exhaled. That's the thing. No one really knows. Nathaniel Crawford wasn't in the public eye. He wasn't the type to appear in magazine interviews or on corporate panels. But behind closed doors, he was a force. One of those men who built fortunes by dismantling others. He specialized in taking over companies in distress, restructuring them just enough to turn a massive profit, then selling them off like spare parts. And he was a major shareholder in La Lumiere. Alexander felt the weight of that realization settle in. Arthur Grant had been powerful, but he had always been the face of his own empire. Nathaniel, on the other hand, operated in silence. Arthur was never the top of the chain. Alexander muttered, he was a pawn. Lucas nodded. And Nathaniel? He's the one who moves the pieces. The next morning, Alexander received a message. It was slipped under his office door. No signature, no sender, just a single line printed neatly on thick, expensive stationery. Walk away. This game isn't for the weak. Alexander stared at the words for a long moment, then set the note down without a word. The research into Nathaniel continued. Lucas had pulled financial records, news clippings, private equity reports. The more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Nathaniel rarely attached his name to anything directly, but his influence was everywhere. He controlled companies through holding firms, exerted power through proxies. He never took risks himself. He let men like Arthur do the dirty work. And when they fell, he simply replaced them. Alexander glanced at a portfolio summary on Lucas's screen. How much power does he have in this company? Lucas hesitated. He's the second largest shareholder. Just behind you, which means he can challenge me. Alexander finished the thought. Nathaniel had remained quiet during the fallout from Arthur's downfall. But now, with Arthur out of the picture, he had no reason to stay in the shadows. Alexander made the first move. He requested a private meeting. No board members, no legal teams, just the two of them. He wanted to see Nathaniel in person, to measure the man behind the money. The meeting was set for the following evening at an exclusive, members-only lounge in the city. No cameras, no interruptions. When Alexander arrived, Nathaniel was already waiting. He was younger than Alexander had expected. Mid-40s, sharply dressed but without the usual arrogance that came with wealth. He looked like a man who never raised his voice because he never had to. Nathaniel didn't bother with pleasantries. You've been busy, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, turning over stones, chasing ghosts. Alexander took a seat across from him. I don't chase ghosts. I deal with problems. Nathaniel smirked. And you think I'm a problem? I think you funded Arthur's operation. And I think you're still moving money through this company in ways that won't hold up under scrutiny. Nathaniel chuckled. Scrutiny? That's a cute word. You think you can expose me like you did Arthur? Arthur was reckless, sloppy. I am neither. Alexander studied him. Arthur thought he was untouchable. 2. Nathaniel leaned forward slightly. Arthur was useful until he wasn't. When a piece stops serving its purpose, you replace it. That's how the world works. His tone was casual, almost amused, as if he were explaining a simple business principle rather than acknowledging the destruction of men who had once been powerful. Alexander felt the shift, the moment when the real battle began. Arthur had been predictable. He had fought to hold onto power, clinging to it with desperation. Nathaniel was different. He didn't need power in the traditional sense. He operated from the shadows, playing a long game. That made him far more dangerous. Nathaniel Crawford leaned back in his chair, his expression smooth, unbothered. Across from him, Alexander sat still, watching, waiting. The air between them was thick with unspoken consequences. You think you've won, Nathaniel said, voice calm, measured. Arthur was a pawn, easy to replace. His downfall changes nothing for me. He picked up his glass, swirling the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. But you've made things complicated. Alexander said nothing. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating deals worth billions, facing men who wielded power like a weapon. Nathaniel was different. He didn't just control businesses, he controlled the people inside them. I'm offering you a deal, Nathaniel continued, setting his glass down. Let's stop this nonsense. You run the company as you see fit. I stay out of your way. In return, I invest hundreds of millions. Enough to expand globally. Solidify La Lumiere's dominance. No interference. No strings. Alexander arched an eyebrow. And if I refuse? Nathaniel smiled. Then I dismantle everything you've built. I won't have to lift a finger. Your own board members will turn on you. Investors will pull out. The media will eat you alive. I can make you fight so many battles that eventually, you won't have the strength left to win any of them. Lucas, standing nearby, had his phone discreetly recording. But Alexander knew that a single recording wouldn't be enough. Nathaniel was too careful, too connected. You expect me to stand aside while you keep running your schemes? Alexander asked. I expect you to be pragmatic. Nathaniel corrected. I don't care about the restaurant business. Alexander, I care about control. I let Arthur play his games because they were profitable. Now, I'm offering you a chance to be smarter than him. For a moment, Alexander considered his options. Accepting Nathaniel's offer would mean stability. No more financial threats. No legal battles. The company would flourish, at least on the surface. But it would be a hollow victory. The price of power wasn't just control, it was integrity. And Alexander refused to sell his. As he weighed his decision, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Emma. Check your email, now. Alexander opened the attachment, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the document. A financial report. A series of large transactions leading back to Nathaniel. David and Emma had uncovered something big, a shadow investment firm that had been moving Nathaniel's money through international accounts, tied to suspected laundering operations. This wasn't just corporate fraud. It was federal crime. Alexander looked up, slipping his phone back into his pocket. I appreciate the offer, he said, his tone neutral, but I think I'll pass. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment, then exhaled softly. Shame. I had a feeling you'd be difficult. He rose from his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. Before he left, he leaned in slightly and murmured, You think this ends with me? You've only seen half the board. And then he was gone. That night, Alexander met with Lucas, Emma, and David in his office. We have enough to take this to the authorities, Lucas said, scrolling through the files. Nathaniel isn't just another corrupt businessman. He's part of something bigger. Emma nodded. If we expose this, he won't just lose money. He'll be facing federal investigations. Maybe even international charges. Alexander leaned back in his chair, considering the weight of what they had just uncovered. Nathaniel had been right about one thing. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of a much larger war. But Alexander Pierce had never been one to back down. The storm had been building for weeks. But now, it was about to break. Nathaniel Crawford had made his move. The pressure on Alexander was mounting, board members wavering, rumors spreading, subtle threats slipping through anonymous channels. This wasn't just about corporate control anymore. This was a war waged in the highest circles of power, where money dictated truth and influence could rewrite history. Lucas stood by the window of Alexander's office, scrolling through the latest reports. Another 2 board members just withdrew their support. He said, They're scared. Some of them are getting visits from people they don't want to name. Alexander exhaled slowly. Nathaniel's trying to isolate us. Make it look like we're the problem. Emma, sitting across the desk, looked grim. And it's working. If we don't move first, we'll be the ones playing defense. Alexander nodded. Then we don't wait. We end this now. Lucas hesitated, then pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. We have enough evidence to destroy him. Financial trails linking him to illegal transactions. Shell companies. Offshore laundering. But this, he tapped the folder. This is different. Alexander opened it. The documents were damning. Testimony from a former associate. A witness who had once worked for Nathaniel. Detailing how he had orchestrated a cover-up years ago, silencing someone who had threatened to expose him. It wasn't just fraud. It was criminal obstruction. This is what brings him down, Lucas said. Alexander's plan was set in motion. The files were sent, discreetly but deliberately, to one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. Someone whose reputation was untouchable. Whose work couldn't be buried by legal threats or corporate influence. At the same time, Alexander reached out to the board members who still had integrity. Evelyn Carter, the senior shareholder who had turned against Arthur, agreed to help. They called for an emergency meeting. One that Nathaniel wouldn't be able to control. The battlefield was drawn. The boardroom was silent when Nathaniel walked in. He carried himself as if he still owned the room. But Alexander saw it. The tightness in his jaw. The way his fingers flexed at his sides. He knew something was coming. Nathaniel took his seat and smirked. So, what's the crisis this time? Alexander folded his hands. We're here to discuss the future of this company. Nathaniel leaned back. That's funny, because from where I'm sitting, my future looks just fine. Across the table, Lucas checked his phone. Then he looked up and gave a single nod. And then it happened. A notification flashed across every device in the room. A breaking news alert. Exclusive report. Billionaire investor tied to international money laundering and criminal cover-ups. Nathaniel's phone buzzed violently. His face darkened as he skimmed the article. The leaked documents. The anonymous testimony. It was all there. Out in the open. Across the room, Evelyn spoke calmly. Nathaniel, I think it's time we discuss your resignation. Nathaniel let out a slow breath, as if composing himself. Then, he chuckled. You think this is it? He said. You think one article erases me? Alexander met his gaze. No, but the subpoenas will. Nathaniel's smirk faltered. Lucas slid a printed document across the table. The Justice Department is already reviewing the case. And since you like power so much, I'm sure you'll enjoy spending the next few years fighting for it in court. Nathaniel's hands curled into fists. His entire empire had just been set on fire. And there was nothing he could do to put it out. Alexander stood. You've played this game a long time. But today, you lose. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, then slowly rose from his chair. As he walked past Alexander, he murmured, You have no idea what you've just started. Then he was gone. And for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. The fallout was swift. The moment the financial records and witness testimonies hit the public, Nathaniel Crawford's empire began to collapse. Government agencies launched full-scale investigations. His business partners scrambled to cut ties. Stockholders who had once stood behind him now pretended they had never known him at all. The boardroom that had once been his playground turned against him overnight. At a formal meeting, the remaining directors cast their votes. Nathaniel Crawford was officially removed from the company. His assets within the organization were frozen. Pending further investigation, he was no longer untouchable. Across the city, headlines captured the moment in real time. Business tycoon under federal investigation for financial crimes. Nathaniel Crawford's corporate empire crumbles. But Alexander knew better than to celebrate too soon. In the days that followed, the effects rippled outward. Richard and Arthur, once believing themselves too powerful to fall, were now facing legal proceedings. The weight of their crimes finally caught up to them. David returned to La Lumiere. His suspension lifted, his reputation restored, but something had changed in him. His time away had hardened him, given him a new sense of purpose. One evening, as Alexander walked through the restaurant, he found David reviewing service protocols, speaking with staff, not as a victim who had been wronged, but as someone ready to lead. You're doing good work, Alexander said. David glanced up, then smiled. I had a good example to follow. Emma and Lucas remained at Alexander's side. The three of them now bound not just by business but by a shared understanding. One battle had been won. But the war was far from over. During a televised interview, a journalist posed a question. Do you think you've eliminated corruption from your company? Alexander took a measured breath, then offered a small, knowing smile. I think I've exposed part of it. But corruption isn't just one man, or one scheme. There will always be others in the shadows, waiting for their turn. The journalist pressed. Then what's next? Alexander's gaze didn't waver. We stay ready. As the interview ended, Lucas approached him, a manila folder in hand. We found something, he said. Alexander took the file. On the cover was a name he didn't recognize, another power broker. Another hidden force lurking beneath the surface. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, He closed the folder and turned toward the city skyline. Nathaniel had been a chapter. But the story wasn't over yet. Power isn't just about who sits at the top, it's about how they choose to use it. Alexander could have looked the other way. But true leadership means standing up when it matters most. Corruption thrives in silence, but one voice can start a revolution. So, what would you do if you uncovered a hidden truth? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more stories that reveal what lies beneath.